Hello, LilyPod lovers, and welcome to another episode of LilyPod. We have a special guest today. Heidi Totten is a former mid-single and until got married, of course, had never been married. So she's not divorced or widowed, but took her longer than a lot of Latter-day Saints to get married. And we think this is an important perspective to have on our show. I should point out also, we're going to let Heidi introduce herself, but she is doing some great work in Kenya with her charity called 100 Humanitarians International. Heidi, would you like to go ahead and add to that introduction?
Sure. So my name is Heidi Totten, and I was raised in Phoenix, Arizona, in the inner city, by a single mom in the 1970s, which, was relatively more rare in the church at that time. And uh, she was inactive, but somehow I always made it to church. So now she's active, but it was an interesting upbringing in terms of the dynamic of family life and marriage. I went to BYU, which shifted things a little bit, but then I didn't get married at BYU and ultimately ended up in Northern Virginia in the singles life out there before meeting my husband and getting married at the ripe old age of 30. Since then, I've had a career in technical recruiting and in business coaching and consulting. And then in 2015, I went on an expedition to Kenya, a humanitarian expedition, and saw where my skills and all the things I had learned when I was single, I have to add that caveat, I would not be able to do what I'm doing today had I not had those life experiences, led me to start a humanitarian organization called 100 Humanitarians International, where we focus on building sustainable communities, one family at a time, through economic development and self-reliance. And our focus is in Kenya, but we've partnered with other organizations to bring our programs to different locations. So it's expanding, but our core work is done in Kenya and in the United States. So I'm married. I have two children that are now teenagers, and one is getting ready to leave on a mission, and just loving life.
Yeah.
So there you go.
We haven't been to Kenya yet, but we have been to Ethiopia, Africa, and absolutely loved it. It was kind of a pre-honeymoon for us and where we got engaged. So we have a special place in our hearts for Africa. And when I met you, Jeff has known you a while, but I thought that was really cool that you do work over there.
Yeah, it's an incredible experience to have, and I absolutely encourage everybody to travel internationally, and especially to travel to countries where you see just how privileged we are. I'm not going to say blessed. They are very blessed, and they believe that they're very blessed, and their standard of living is not our standard of living. So when we put our standards on them, then what we see is poverty. But when they share how blessed they are with us, then we see a whole different mindset around what makes you happy in life.
Exactly. So, and I remember that. I remember seeing just tiny little kids, just running around, eating sugar cane and just smiling, so many smiles and so much happiness. And that's definitely something we observed.
Yeah, I like to say the happiest people I know don't wear shoes.
Yeah, none of them were wearing shoes, I don't think. But
no, I'm always like, why do we want to take shoes to them? They're happy. They're getting grounded all the time, running around in the dirt.
Yeah.
So
our brother-in-law who is Ethiopian, and just finished a university degree here in the United States. I asked him one day, what was childhood like in Ethiopia? I asked him a bunch of questions, but his first response was so happy. And it didn't matter to him really that nobody had anything. In fact, I looked almost with a certain amount of envy on some of those kids, because when I was a kid, we ran around barefoot, we built tree houses, we roamed the neighborhood, we had a lot more freedom. our generation of parents kind of helicopter parented their kids, and you were looked at as almost abusive if you let your kids out of the house without supervision. And I think our kids have missed out on a lot that way. And those kids over there in Ethiopia, they didn't have that issue, you know. They
very
solved
true.
problems with each other and dealt with friendships and just all that stuff.
Yeah, you know, when you're living in a community, I work a lot with the Maasai, and they're the indigenous tribe to Kenya. Kenya has 44 tribes, so and they've all fought the Maasai at one point or another. And in working with the Maasai, you know, forgiveness is a different concept for them because they have to live and work and be in their community, and there isn't, it's not common for somebody who lives in a manyatta, a traditional mud hut, to say, well, tired of this, I'm moving to Nairobi. You know, I mean, and so when you're in a community where literally the people that you know are the people you've known your entire life, and there's conflict, it's their response is, I forgive you, you know, and they stew, and then they forgive, and then they move on. And it has been a life lesson for me to just say, oh, okay, I forgive you. You know, like we have the luxury of, oh, I don't like that person, I'm just going to avoid them. But that's not a luxury that is in these communities and villages in Kenya, for sure.
And yet it's not really a luxury, it's a detriment, because if we are living with that inside ourselves.
True. And you know, and that's kind of what I experienced when I was in the singles wards. Right.
Yeah, now let's hear about your experience with singles wards, because you have some very specific things you want to say about this.
Yeah, but you know, this is a soapbox for me a little bit, but it's just through life experience, and I maintain that this is my life experience. It's not everyone's life experience. It's just, you know, what I viewed. My degree is in family science, and so I was taught to look at behavior.
All three of ours is actually.
Yeah, we're just family science nerds, I guess. But but you know, we're taught to look at the behavior, identify behaviors, look at what people are experiencing. In fact, last night I went to the Sapria Gala, and they're all about helping people, especially women, heal from child sexual abuse. And it's interesting because of course it was so prevalent when we were growing up, but never talked about. And so now in their 40s and 50s, you're seeing the impact in depression, in the helicopter parenting, as you mentioned. I firmly believe that the reason why helicopter parenting really became a thing, not because our kids are not safe, it's because their parents were not safe. This is their coping mechanism for dealing with the abuse that they experienced, and they flip and think, if I helicopter my kids, they won't experience that as well. And so we're seeing the results of the experiences that were had when life was flexible and we could roam the neighborhood, into I need to be in control. So I moved to Northern Virginia after I graduated from BYU. I rotted in Provo for a couple of years after graduation. I was like, in fact, I remember going into the vice president of student life because my stepmother was his assistant. And I said, so I get a tuition refund, right? I mean, I graduated BYU without getting married. That's like no small feat. And they didn't give me one. But anyway, I actually had to go to work. But I decided to move to Northern Virginia on a whim, really. It was my cousin Eric who said, hey, if I don't move to New York, he was in theater, and he said, if I don't move to New York, we should move to DC. And I said, I'm going to anyway. And I just literally set a date, packed my car, had no place to live, no job, and about $800 in my bank account. And then my cousin wrecked my car in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we kind of clunked into Northern Virginia, and ended up staying with my mother's cousin for a few weeks. And I started a temp job. My very first temp job was at the Watergate Hotel, which I thought was pretty cool. And then I started going to singles ward out there. It was called the Colonial Ward.
I was a member of that ward for a while.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge ward, and you look around and it's like all the pretty people that work on the Hill. And I was like,
Right.
these are the BYU rejects that couldn't get married, and they're all gorgeous and they're brilliant and they've got master's degrees
And they're
and
hugely motivated, and yeah,
hugely motivated. And I just thought
that was the culture of the ward when I was there too.
absolutely. I mean, it was a huge challenge to get to know people because there were so many people. It was like a mini high school. And so I attended the Colonial Ward for a while, and I was going to Institute. God has a funny way of saying, okay, I'm going to just direct you into this situation. I ended up meeting the Institute Council president, was the very first person I met when I walked into the ward. And he ended up living around the corner, working across the street, and was assigned to be my home teacher. So it was like, there was no way that I wasn't going to meet him. And brilliant man. To this day, like, I absolutely credit him for taking me to a deeper level of understanding the gospel, because we would have lunch every single week and we would just discuss gospel topics. So I started attending Institute, and back then there were about 15 members of Institute going to the King Street building. So here's this huge ward, nobody going to Institute, because they had all graduated from BYU, and they were like, hey, we took our 14 hours, we're good. Like, we don't need to do any more than that. And where I really loved Institute, I felt like it was even deeper than the classes I took at BYU, because you didn't have the pressure of the grades. And so I was called to the Institute Council, which was awesome, because so you have all these microcosms of singles, right? I mean, the Institute is young single adults, then you have the singles wards, but within the Institute program, it wasn't so focused on, I mean, the socialization was centered around the gospel and around service. It wasn't centered around the meat market concept of a singles ward. And I literally, like, I don't know of any singles wards that can really mimic a family ward feeling. So
Right.
I'm just going to lump that generalization that singles wards facilitate being single and create a social life around being single. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I wanted to just throw in parenthetically what was said, what I said to you off mic earlier, that my brother once wrote me a letter. I happened to be living in the South Pacific at the time with my then wife and child, but he wrote to me and said, I can't believe that our brother Kent is a father and I am still going to stake dances and roller skating parties.
Yeah.
He was in his 30s at that. Well, no, I guess he wasn't quite in his 30s. He was in his late 20s though.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, I sort of laughed at that, and then I became a mid-single later, quite a bit older than he had been at that time, and I started going to stake dances and roller skating parties.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends that are on the other side of divorce right now, and I watch them, and I actually stayed with one of my friends. My family had COVID, and I had returned from Kenya. And so I stayed with my friend for 10 days, and she lives in a house, and it's all single women, and they were all talking about boys and activities. And I was like, okay, I'm so triggered. I obviously have not healed my trauma from being in a singles ward. I can't deal with this. It was like, I said, you guys sound like you're 16. How has this not evolved? And I mean, I have to kind of transfer my mind. Okay, people like dancing. It's not going to dances. It's, oh, we like dancing, right? So, but that's not something that typically people who are married do. Not a lot of married people go out dancing, right? And so I remember we had an Institute dance for New Year's Eve or something like that. And they said, yeah, come, we're going to serve dinner. And they served this huge vat of chili. I was like, you're serving chili to a bunch of people trying to get married at a dance? I'm like, this is just like a gut bomb waiting to happen. I mean, it was like, but we were treated like we were young men and young women.
Right.
Like, that was the problem, is that the mindset was not, well, let's treat them like adults and create, and as I mentioned to you, Well, I was first in the colonial ward, and then I moved to the Langley ward, and then I said enough, and I just went to a family ward, and I was so blissfully happy because you actually don't have the pressure of getting married in a family ward as much, because they're like, they don't care. They're living their own lives, you know? And then I ultimately went to a more rural singles ward, and I was moving into a townhouse, and I was like, I'm just going to go for the summer before my townhouse is finished. And then, I'm going to go to the family ward. And that's where I ended up meeting my husband. But the bishop of that ward said, this is ridiculous. You're adults, create your own social life. We're only doing service. And so
This was the
everything we
colonial
did,
ward bishop or
this was
the
the Shenandoah ward.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was pretty far out. A lot of the people who were attending that ward had grown up in Virginia. So it wasn't as much of the BYU transplant concept as it was these were people who were raised there, their families lived in Virginia, or they had moved out for a job but lived further out because it was less expensive. They weren't working on the Hill, they were working in the tech industry. And so that's where I ended up meeting my husband. But because that ward was all about service, they had 15 marriages that summer, inter-ward marriages, and it was a lot smaller than the bigger wards that were closer in to the Beltway. But my feeling was in going, what was interesting, this is a big thing. When I went from the singles ward to the family ward, I was 28, 29. It was around the 9/11 time period. And so it was, in a way, it felt isolating. But what was interesting was because I was no longer in their faces or available, I had dates every weekend. Where my roommates who were still going to the singles ward were still pursuing boys. I would listen to two of my roommates, bless their hearts, I called them Romy and Michelle. I mean, they were just, and they would come home from church and be like, well, I talked to 3 boys. How many did you talk to? And I was like, no, I'm 29 years old. This is not the conversation I'm having. I mean, it just got ridiculous. And what I saw was how many like opportunities men in the ward had to not ask out. They were not under any pressure to ask women out on dates because their social lives were completely planned, because women were planning everything and inviting them to it. So they didn't have to go out of their way to make the effort. Well, when I disappeared, then the phone rang. Hey, what are you doing? We can go on a date and not be in a fishbowl. And nobody's going to assume that we're going to get married after one date.
So do you think there?
Yeah, that is an issue at church schools and in that general socialism that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is an element in that of, well, if I'm going to the colonial ward or to whatever other singles ward, that if I date someone in the ward and it doesn't work out, that everybody's going to know and it's going to be a big gossip thing? And
For sure. That's how high school is.
right. You didn't want to date the girls in your home ward in high school because if it didn't end well, you had to go to church with them after that.
So why would you do that in a singles world? I mean, that's the thing. And everybody knew you broke up, and it was like, oh my gosh. And then that man became like a magnet for every other woman. Oh, he's available. And it was like, no. It didn't work in reverse. It wasn't like a girl became available and then all the men in the ward went after her, because as I mentioned, I mean, women often take the dating responsibility off of men's shoulders. And, ultimately it was pretty funny because the singles ward that I had been in, the final ward, they called me right after the birth of my son. And they said, hey, we would really love you to come and talk to our Relief Society about dating do's and don'ts. And I just had to laugh. And I was like, I'm not sure I'm that successful at this topic just because I managed to get married, And but I said, okay, I'll do it. I've got some unpopular opinions on this. I wish the church would disband singles wards all over the world and then just create more opportunities for support within family wards, and just setting up like you said, oh, your brother or my cousin was going to set up your brother with me. None of that ever happened. Like people were always like, oh, I said, you don't have to set us up. You can simply say, hey, I would love to introduce you to get to know each other. I mean,
Right.
it doesn't have to be this high pressure thing. But I mean, everybody knows people who are single and they automatically, oh, you should date this person and stuff like that. But then it doesn't often happen. Anyway, so I agreed to do this training for a Relief Society meeting. And what I said was, there are a lot of dating do's. And in my view, there's only one dating don't. So we're going to go through the do's. Get your house in order and figure your life out. As an individual person, nobody completes you. You're your
Right.
own person. So figure out who you are and who you want to be in a marriage and who you want to be in a relationship, rather than waiting for that person to come along so that you can change for them. And I said, get your financial affairs in order, develop your career, develop who you want to be, because nobody ever trains young women on here's what to do in your life if you don't marry the deacons.
Right.
Like that is not a topic of conversation that they want to have. It was all about keep yourself pure so that you marry the boys. And I'm like, okay, but there's a whole aspect to life that young women are never trained on. When I was in Young Women, I was like, let me just sneak this in. You might not get married, or you might not get married until you're older. And please don't waste your life sitting around waiting for that to happen. Like God will interrupt your life with the right person if you're moving forward rather than sitting around waiting. And I've seen it happen to so many women, and it just breaks my heart. And I said, do cultivate friendships with men so that you understand what you like and don't like without the dating pressure. Often I think, especially that desperation that comes in, and I was guilty of this myself. I was basically like, anyone who's cute, anyone, I would go home for my cousin's weddings, and literally it was like, so what's wrong with you? Do you not want to get married? I think this is such a ridiculous conversation. I mean, no, I'm desperately trying to get married. At that time, I was going to a singles ward. I was going to institute 3 times a week. I mean, my entire social life was about the church, and which was fine. I mean, I lived in Northern Virginia. It was the other options were going to bars. So it was that, or, that or a life that I didn't want to lead. So I went through all these dating do's, and I had quotes from prophets and stuff. And then I said, all right. And it was interesting because here's these women. And then they had asked a panel of guys in the ward that they could ask questions. And all the guys are in the back at this table. And I said, there's one dating don't. I said, don't stalk men. I said, don't plan their lives. Don't plan dinners. Don't plan movies. Don't plan all of this. If they want to ask you out, they'll ask you out. If you talk to them for an hour at a ward party and they don't ask you out, they're not interested, because it's really easy to just say, hey, do you want to go to dinner? And I was like, but
Well, a lot of them are afraid to say that, but
they are, because women were facilitating environments where they didn't have to. So they never got practice, right? I mean, I always thought someday my husband and I are like, if my husband's the bishop of a singles ward, I'm going to be like, women, don't plan a dang thing and make these men ask you out. And then I'm going to be like, men, go practice. It doesn't mean you have to propose on the first date. Go ask these women out, like just go out without that pressure. Anyway, so I said, don't stalk boys. Don't ask them out. Don't do this. Don't do this. And all the boys, men in the back of the room, were nodding as I said it. They were like, exactly. Because if so many things are being planned, so as an example, say, so I'll just use you guys as an example. Jeff, say you wanted to ask Cathy out, but what you saw was Cathy planning all these events, going to all these things, interacting with all these people. And you're like, does she even have time in her schedule for a date? Because her schedule is completely taken up by all the activities that she's planning.
Well, that was actually an issue for us.
Yeah, I
in
mean,
the
and it,
beginning. But I understand what you're saying. I think, another little wrinkle on that, I think, I spent 3 years of my, 2.5 years of my mid-single life in Texas.
Mhm.
And out in Midland, where I lived most of that time, there were maybe 2 or 3 single women, and only one that I was even moderately interested in dating. And I tried that a couple of times. It didn't really work out. So I had to go at least 5 hours to meet any other Latter-day Saint singles. But I went to a couple of singles activities out in Dallas, and I had to drive 5 hours to get there and 5 hours home. And what I discovered is that the same regulars were showing up to all the activities. They weren't necessarily seeing it as a place to go to meet somebody you were going to marry. It was more like that was their social life, and that's how they were taking care of their social needs. But it wasn't necessarily oriented toward dating, and any of them that were interested in dating had already dated each other.
Yes.
And so there really wasn't a point to a lot of those activities other than we're bored on Saturday night, let's have a dance,
Mhm.
I'd
Well,
like to
yeah.
speak to what you were saying and how Jeff responded.
Mhm.
And in intentional courtship, I speak directly to women. In our book, we have a chapter to women and chapter to men. And I do encourage women to be intentional about pursuing who they're interested in. I have since, I don't necessarily disagree with what I said initially, but I think there's more to it, right?
Mhm.
There's nuanced interactions. And what you're talking about actually goes along with something that one of the dating coaches we know, who encourages women who want traditionally minded, kind, loving, leadership oriented men, that if you go after them, then you're not going to find someone who's taking the lead. And that makes sense.
Mhm.
So I think it's also true that we need to show our interest, like you said, by talking to them and dropping the handkerchief, giving them the hint, and then either they take it or they don't, and you move on. So I think what I said is true, but I think there's this additional thing that if what you want is a leader, then let them lead.
Well, and there's an awareness piece, right? And that's what I saw a huge lack of. And in reflection, I mean, obviously it's 20 years. My husband and I have been married for almost 20 years. In reflection, I'm like, oh, you sit there and you go, yeah, I did that because you were 30 or in your 20s or older, whatever. Like whenever this time period is in your life, it doesn't really matter because I still feel 18 sometimes, even though, my creaky knees and stuff will remind me that I'm not. But I mean, mentally, we do kind of say there's no way that I'm the age that I am. But I remember one time my roommates did a dinner where we all got dates, and it was a dinner at our house. And so we were going to cook, but we were like, okay, let's all get dates. Well, I asked a friend of mine that we weren't particularly interested in each other. I had a group of guys that were my like, you're a good date if I had to take to company Christmas parties or things like that were non-threatening. I didn't have to worry about being on in any particular way. It was a friendship. And so I had invited this guy that was one of those friends. And my roommate had invited a guy. Well, my roommate the next day said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that your date was totally flirting with me the whole night." And I was like, okay. And literally I hadn't even seen him talk to her at all, like much less anything else. And I was like, what do what do you mean? And she said, well, there was this one moment where he looked at me and I was like, oh, Lozzie, like, I mean, that awareness of just because somebody looks at you, just because somebody talks to you, that doesn't mean that they're getting down on a knee and proposing. It just doesn't. When Dave and I started dating, it was pretty hilarious because we were interested in each other. We were developing a friendship, but I had been coming off of a year and a half on and off relationship. And, he hadn't been dating anyone at the time, but he was doing a lot of service. He was working in the temple. I mean, we were both just leading busy lives. And we actually had our two best friends were planning everything for us. So we just showed up because that was at a time where I was building a townhouse. I was really busy and in my career and stuff like that. And so I wasn't really thinking at that point about dating because I had turned 30. Actually, I remember getting on my knees and just saying, it'd be nice if I got married in November, you work it out. And then I did. So that made it, but then I took the pressure off myself. So the woman that was my visiting teacher, Dave home taught, and she figured out that we were interested in each other and just neither one of us were saying anything. We were talking to each other all the time. We would have these great conversations but we, we just weren't, neither one of us were pursuing it. And she threatened us and said, I'm going to tell her that you're interested, or I'm going to tell him that you're interested if you guys don't have this conversation. And so I flew to Utah for the 4th of July, and he drove me to the airport and he was acting super weird. And I was like, oh, geez, he knows
You know
I'm
what weird
interested.
means, right?
Yeah, well, but at the time I thought he's found out that I'm interested and he's not, and this is super awkward now and whatever. But then he called me in Utah and just to talk. And of course, this was pre-texting. Nobody texted back then, And then when I was flying back, I called my roommate when I got to the airport and she said, okay, look for a silver Jetta. And I said, oh. I said, are you with Dave? And she said, I'm not with him. And I was like, oh, okay. So that was my first clue, like, all right, maybe there's something to this. So we were driving home and he said, look, I'm just going to be honest. I like you. He's like, but we've discussed communication and how this all how this gets convoluted. And he said, so I want to date you. But I also feel like I need to keep dating other people while I'm dating you so that we can figure out, like if this is something that we would be interested in. And I so appreciated that honesty, because I was like, I didn't have to wonder. He was just really direct.
Yeah.
I want to date you. I want to take you out on a date.
And it turned out to be a different kind of word than you originally thought, in a good way.
Well, because our friend Tara had threatened him.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was nervous because he wanted to bring it up on the way to the airport.
Yeah.
But then he chickened out. So then,
and that's actually what I was thinking was the weird, but I can see why you thought, oh no, now it's getting weird because he knows I like him.
I had dealt with so many ridiculous men that could not have that conversation. I mean, ghosting wasn't a thing back then, but it was like basically they would just stop talking to you or stop calling you instead of just saying, hey, you know what? I'm interested in someone else. The guy that I dated right before Dave, I knew he was dating other people. And we were not exclusive. Like we had broken up and we were like, it's fine, whatever you want to do. But we had been friends for a long time. And so at the very least, the respect of I'm going to start dating other people. So, and I want you to know that so that it's not, you don't get blindsided. But I was told that, and then he called me and because he was still, sniffing around, like he couldn't decide. He just still wanted the door open. And I said, yeah, I hear you've been dating up a storm. And for the next half hour, I got to listen to him babble on and on about every single girl he knew and why people may or may not be thinking that he's dating her, including the woman that I knew he was dating. And then I saw them at a movie theater, literally walked past them like a week later. And I was like, why lie? I mean,
Right.
really, I know we're dealing with emotions and the heart and stuff like that, But honestly, that's the problem, is that we go from a high school mentality of dating and we're never really focused on evolving into an adult style of dating, And so it's like there's kind of a stunted growth in that emotional capability, which is why I was telling these women, figure out who you are and hold that boundary and hold that standard for yourself. Because I was very blunt with Dave. And I was just like, listen, communication is key to me now. I mean, I had gotten to a point where I was just done. Now, he picked me up from the airport on July 7th, told me, I want to date you, but I want to date other women. And we were engaged 12 days later. So it was not long lived. But the interesting thing was that we had had so many conversations about relationships prior to that, that when it came down to it, he said, you know what do you think this is with us? Like, where do you think this is going to go? And I said, I think this is it. And he said, I do too. And he was like, does that mean we're getting married? And I said, I think it does. He said,
Wow.
okay. Because because at that point, I mean, we just felt like we had had the conversations. There were two books that were recommended to me that I read in my late 20s. One was Men Made Easy, which was hugely valuable. And I still use those concepts all the time on my husband. And he's like, knows it and he doesn't care. And the other was 1,000 Questions for Couples. And because when you are in that dating relationship, especially when you are panicked about getting married, this isn't everyone. This was me. So I'll say, when you're in that, you don't ask the questions. You don't ask the hard questions because you're like, if I don't know the answer, then he'll still be perfect. If I don't know the answer, then I don't have to like break up with him because I don't agree with them or something like that. Right.
Yeah, this is something I encounter with my coaching clients, more than one, who we get to a point where they will acknowledge, yeah, when I'm in a relationship with someone or when I'm pursuing someone, I start finding myself losing myself and trying to become what they want.
Yes.
And then
that is a recipe for unhappiness.
And I've had coaching clients get really intentional about the 3 to 5 most important things they're looking for. And when they really know that, they're willing to have the hard conversations, even if it means I have to let this person go. And sometimes that has meant some heartache, but then they know and they can move on and they can deal with the reality of the situation. And then sometimes it's paid off and they've had all the things on their short but very specific list that they wanted.
Well, and I think that I was talking to a friend of mine she's 57 and she divorced her husband after about 30 years. And he was pretty emotionally abusive. And she looks back and she's like, I should have left him after a year, like she knew going into it. But he kind of manipulated it and said, well, hey, my patriarchal blessing says I'm going to marry this person and I know that person's you. Well, oh my word. I mean, these are quite frankly, the things that we should be teaching the young men is never, ever, 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 ever say that.
Well, and then with the book, women, actually. Oh yeah, we definitely talk about that. And then
we quote
the women,
Elder Oaks for that.
Well, actually, men and women both need to have personal revelation for themselves and not take that for gospel truth.
Well, one of the things we were talking about, because she's been dating someone, as I said, for me, it's kind of a trifecta. I mean, one was obviously for me the gospel, and being able to whoever I was going to be dating, being able to marry them in the temple. And I had dated a guy who he had been married twice before and he had a son and he was inactive. And I was like, deal breaker, like I just, that's not where I am in my life right now, even though he was the best date because he knew how to date. Like he would call me up. Do you want to go to dinner on Friday night? I mean, it was like, how refreshing. We would go to movies, we would go to concerts. I mean, it was dating and not dancing youth activities, right? It was one-on-one dates.
But
and
it also
so,
wasn't real life every day or every Sunday when that comes around and you're doing different things.
right. And you know what? I mean, awesome, awesome how it all turned out. He actually did um go back into activity and went back to the temple, and he's married and they live, and this was back in Virginia. He's married, they live 2 miles away. I'm really good friends with their family. They've spent Christmas Eve with us, and I was the doula for his wife for all three of their children.
Oh,
So,
wow.
like, there
So
you go.
you met in another state, but now you are all in
Now
Utah.
we all live 2 miles away from each other. And
Huh.
and actually, I just last Saturday went out to dinner with his wife and daughter for their birthday. And I don't see him that often, but everything, like, the relationship was healthy, and then the relationship was done because
Right.
of the shared values. And so, but it was, for me, it was this kind of trifecta. So it's the gospel first, like, do you both have those values? Then second was the internal relationship. Like, how is the internal relationship in terms of communication, in terms of day-to-day activities, in terms of getting things done? I have a best guy friend besides Dave, who's my brother from another mother, that everybody thought that we would get married, because we were such good friends. We never dated, but I was like, somebody has to take out the garbage. Like, neither one of us would, because we would just be sitting there talking all day, like, so there's the logistics, right? There's literally the internal doing life together. And how does that work? I was on a date with my husband on Thursday, and our son he's getting ready to go on a mission, and he had his meeting with the bishop, and he came home and he was like, I'm going, I'm excited. And then the next day, that crash of, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And so my husband had said, I go to the temple and just go and sit and reflect. And so we were discussing it, and I said, hey, I stayed up for Josh to get home, but I didn't talk to him. Did you talk to him? And he said, yes, he got the answer he was seeking. So it's literally that doing life, right? It's, I didn't do it, but did you do it? And you didn't do it, but did I do it? Right? Like, so that you have that connection and that companionship. And then there's the external. How are they out in the world? And do you understand each other's needs in that respect? I'm an extrovert and I can go to events all the time. And my husband is happy to go, but it is not his happy place. He goes because he wants to be with me, but not because he's an extrovert and wants to talk to a bunch of people. No, he likes people. He just is like, I don't know what to say, And so there are some things that I'm like, hey, I need you there for this. And there are other things where I'm like, you get a cave night, I'm out of here. Right. And him understanding Heidi needs that. So I can't expect, cuddling on the couch every single night, because that's not her love language. And I understand Dave needs this, so I'm not going to take him to something that I really know he's not going to enjoy. I'm going to find one of my female friends whose husband also doesn't enjoy that, and we're going to go together. Right.
Yeah. So balancing your different needs.
Exactly. So it's the internal, what are the strengths and weaknesses, and how are we compatible internally, and how are we compatible externally? And then the gospel. So if you have two that are really great, then that's awesome. If you have all three, then it's awesomer. But if you only have one, it's not going to work. It's just not.
I want to ask you about something related to something you said a minute ago. And I'll start it by saying this. Like, you talked about this guy that you dated and you ultimately decided not to because of different lifestyle preferences at that time, and
I think it was the lack of shared values.
the
right?
lack of shared values. And I was thinking, that sort of struck me with, there's a woman I dated in my middle years that Cathy asked me two birthdays ago what I wanted to do for my birthday, and I said, I want to go out for sushi with these two people, her and her husband. And Cathy knew them already. They were friends, and we actually been out to eat with them a couple of times over the years. And I think the reason I bring this up is it illustrates, like with that woman, and she sent me condolences when my son was killed recently. Um, you know, kind of understands me in some ways. And so I think it is never awkward between her and me. We had a dating relationship that didn't work out for various reasons, and we're both still adults. We're friends. She's a friend to Cathy. There's boundaries that protect our married relationship, but I think that a lot of the dating awkwardness that we have, especially among mid singles, is because we really don't get out of that high school mentality. You know, it's how many women can I date at one time on, you know, sort of, and keep it quiet from everybody. And you talked about how you thought it was refreshing that Dave came right out and told you what he wanted.
Mhm.
And that's something we emphasize to a lot of people. Look, it eliminates the awkwardness if you just say what you want. And
And it's
It's-
not easy,
it's
but
not
it's
easy to do.
important. And when you mentioned like the ghosting wasn't a thing, but people would just stop talking to you or just stop communicating. Well, we define ghosting personally as anything that changes the status quo of a relationship without a conversation. And that
Mhm.
can even happen between friends. And it's immature. It is. And if we want to mature past those ways of dealing as we're teenagers and we don't know how to have those conversations, I mean, I think we have to have those conversations.
Well, you mentioned he looked at me in a certain way, and you know that what your friend said about this guy flirting with her, and I think
She's
women are
not married,
notorious.
by the way.
What's
To
that?
to this day, she's not married.
Yeah. Well, I think women are notorious for this, but I think a lot of men do it too. Uh, they go back and they talk to their same-sex friends or their, you know, best opposite sex friend that they're never going to date. Oh, I talked to so and so in the foyer or at the linger longer after church, and he said this, right? And he wouldn't have said that if he wasn't at least a little interested, or, you know, and they sit there for hours parsing what somebody said at the word linger longer when it probably didn't mean much.
Well, and I will
You know,
admit, I actually did that once. And of course, that relationship could never go anywhere because then it became a thing between girls. And so for me, I noticed and I just didn't do that again because I was like, oh, that doesn't work. That does not work. And that's a reversion, you know, to my high school days of dating. And, you know, and I want to just give some compassion to those who are divorced, who re-enter the dating world and they haven't been there since they were teenagers. And it's really awkward trying to figure out how to do it different at first.
Well, and you know, honestly, what I would say in those situations is, and you know, I joke all the time. I'm like, there is no way and no amount of money that could ever get me to enter the dating world again. Like ever. I will just hang out with my women friends and my cousins and my, you know, like I will just, there is no way. And so I've told Dave, I'm like, so just so you know, if you go before me and it's too early, then I'm just going to spend the rest of my life being really mad at you. But I'm not, you know, there's just no cell in my body after watching what my friends are going through that makes me want to go back into that world. Because of that, because of what they say. I had a friend who she went out on a blind date, met him in, you know, an online app, and they went to lunch and he said, first date at lunch, LDS, he said, so I sleep with women by the third date in order to see if we're sexually compatible. She's like, and done. Like, what? I mean, now that's going too far in the communication pattern. You know,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
that's just like,
well, I don't
okay,
know. If that's really what he wants to do, then I think
why
he
is he
should
dating
say it,
LDS
and then the
women?
girl
You
can
know?
make up her own mind
Actually,
whether
that
that's
is
okay
true.
with her.
He did her a favor and she could get out
Yeah.
fast.
But it was
I
just
mean,
so
now
funny
whether that's
because
the right thing for him to want, that's a whole other discussion. But I think if that's really where he's at, well, be straight, you know?
right. It's just that type of thing I was heard over and over and over. Like, and I was just like, what on earth this is insane. I mean, and I had a few really hilarious setups and stuff like that. I mean, one guy that my mom set me up with, we had a great date. I was in Arizona, so it wasn't really going to work out, but we had a great date. And then at the door, he starts to talk about how his mission president was a cattle rancher and, told him that cows have different personalities and that when he got home from his mission, he should date a lot of women so that he can determine their personalities like cows. And I was like, are you telling me how many cows I'm worth? I'm not sure where you're going with this, but it was a really awkward way to end the date, and, I mean, I had one blind date where he was absolutely flabbergasted that I wasn't a vegetarian, which was never a conversation we had had. And I was like, and this was like, in the 90s. Who was a vegetarian in the 90s? Nobody was a vegetarian in the 90s, but he was. And so, so I had weird things like that where it was just,
I had someone that wanted to make me a vegetarian in order to become his wife.
Yeah, I mean, we all have our things, I get that. I think that the key is the communication needs to be more about objective. Like if I go into a dating situation and I say, this is my outlook on life, the church is a priority for me. I really am not I'm not an outdoorsy person. I don't want to go boating and hiking every single weekend. These are the things that I like to do. Do you? That's that external thing, right? Do we like to do similar things? Do we like to do it together? Or are we okay with doing them apart? Like I did not have a requirement that Dave had to go to everything with me and do everything with me. I was pretty independent. But I think that in a business world, right? If you read books like The Outward Mindset, Leadership and Self-Deception, The Arbinger, yeah. When you read books like that, it's all about shared objectives. And so if you're like, this is my objective in life, I mean, taking the romance and everything and attraction, because that comes and goes with people who are right for you and not right for you. I mean, attraction has nothing to do with compatibility at all. It's like so you have to look at it like, all right, getting past the initial attraction.
Well, as long as it comes as often as it goes.
Right. Well, I'm just
if
saying,
there's just nothing there, then probably that's not a good relationship for
But
you.
I agree,
Sure.
Attraction's not the main thing.
It's
It
not the
has to
main
be
thing.
there, but it's not the main thing.
It's not the main thing.
Yeah.
It's the shared objectives in life. It's saying, are we trying to accomplish the same thing in our lives? And can we support each other in doing that? Awesome. And that was
how many people know what they want when they're 20 and get married based on attraction? And that's why we end up with a lot of divorces.
right. And they don't, and it's and they get married based on pressure. And this is a big thing that the elephant in the room that I need to address. Two elephants in the room that I need to address. One is how often women, especially when you look at the stats, have experienced some sort of sexual abuse or trauma in their lives that is not addressed and is not worked on. I can't say healed, because a 22-year-old that was, that experienced childhood sexual abuse is not necessarily healed, but that understands or has some sort of path for healing, right? Versus I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen, which is so prevalent in the culture of the church, right? And it's changing with this generation. However, it is still there. So often what happens is a woman will get married. She hasn't addressed sexual abuse, and it shows up in anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts and disassociation.
Sexual frigidity. I mean,
Yeah,
you can go
like
down the list of things.
you can go down the list of things. And so then that does damage to a marriage that doesn't necessarily need to be the damage of a marriage. So that's one thing, right? Is to just say, okay, we have to look at what are the possible triggers, because if a woman has experienced child sexual abuse and she's in her 20s, it's not going to show up in her 20s. It's going to show up in her 50s. And that's when the divorce happens, right? Like that's when it's like, oh my gosh, I've changed so much. I've created this awareness. So having
let me make one caveat to that, because I agree with what you're saying. But also, I think there's one way it does show up in their 20s or 30s. And that is, I think for some, they get accustomed to or habituated to dealing with stressful situations by mentally checking out.
Yes,
And so
disassociation.
you're having a discussion with your husband that's a little bit tense.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm gone. I'm out of here. Even if you're still there physically, you freeze up and you're not there emotionally. You're not there. You're kind of doing your best to just get it over with, to get out of the situation.
Well, statistically, 85% of women who experienced it have some sort of mental health issue.
Right. And
Okay.
that's not surprising.
No, and nationally, 1 in 5 women have experienced it before the age of 18. In Utah, it's 1 in 4, and
Well, and
that's
it's like
only
1 in 6
reported.
men too.
Yeah,
I mean,
and that's only reported. So women can experience it and not report it, but it impacts every area of their lives. And I think that a key for men, and I'm speaking to the men who would listen to this, is the awareness around how it can impact your wife and ultimately impact your marriage, and what tools you can use or learn to support her, because it is not something that she chose, right? I think that when I look at those stats and then I look at the divorce rate, I'm like, there you go. There you
Right.
go. You know, like
Oh, it's huge.
it's huge. So I think that's a huge thing. The other thing is marriage prep. Like just straight up marriage prep. We are so, as a culture, so quick to rush teenagers down the aisle or across the altar without any sort of preparation, without any sort of reality check. And then we see that show up later, right? That it's like, I mean, this Cinderella, a man is going to show up and take care of me. To your point, 1 in 6 men, the men are damaged too. And there's even less resources and less conversation around that. Right. So then you're dealing with literally 2 people who possibly everybody's like, oh my gosh, they're so perfect for each other. And I'm like, oh, they have no idea if they're perfect for each other. Like there's no, because they're cute now, because they're like cute and skinny and college students or whatever
Well,
like that.
And I think that marriage prep is important at every age,
Absolutely.
including when we're older and we've re-entered the dating world. And there's a different kind of marriage prep, meaning we need to know, okay, it's not if, but when are the triggers from your past trauma in relationships going to come up, and how are you going to deal with them as a couple? And
Mhm.
so we've developed our own resources through Lily Coaching. And Jeff has a great premarital coaching program for anyone interested. And I wish that it was more of a thing that everyone just does, rather
Mhm.
than like, we've got to reach people and try and convince them they need this. Like we did premarital therapy ourselves. And
Right.
so,
Absolutely.
I mean, we're offering what we think is important and what we did for us.
And I mean, that
What
wasn't
should be
because we were
required?
having any particular issues. It was really
No,
just
it was
something
preventative.
we both wanted to do to, fine tune things and help us discover any problems that we might have. And I think it's valuable for that.
And it should not be a stigma,
No.
or, I mean, truly, it should not be a stigma. I think when we are talking about, as a culture, as a church, creating eternal marriages, um, we need to empower everyone with the best tools and resources and mentoring and support to make that happen, if that is our goal. So many of my friends stayed in marriages so much longer than they should have because of a temple wedding, because of a
Right.
temple marriage, because they thought that if they walked away from what was abusive and what was, not making them happy, that it was shame, and and then it made them less than, right.
Well,
And-
Heidi, that's why I stayed as long as I did too.
Well, and it took Jeff a long time to figure this out, but he came up with a 3-step formula for deciding about divorce, and we did a podcast on it. So I just like to refer all Lily Pod listeners to that.
The divorce
I
decision.
don't,
is the
yeah, it's called the
title.
divorce decision. I don't remember the number, but if you're in that situation, that's a good one because it's not something we talk about. It's always
I
stay
know.
in the marriage, or okay, now that you're divorced, let's deal with that. But like, what about the deciding?
Absolutely. And I mean, it breaks my heart to hear their stories that they're like, I should have left. And then what happens is that then they have children, they raise their children in this dysfunctional relationship. Their children go on to have dysfunctional relationships because it hasn't been modeled, it just is heartbreaking. And not to say, oh my gosh, marriage should be love and bliss and flowers and butterflies for 40 years or you're doing it wrong. I'm talking about abuse, I mean, I'm talking
Right.
about legitimate, like legitimate challenges that cannot be overcome just with counseling, because sometimes people do need to go their separate ways in order to heal.
Yeah.
Or
that will not be
so,
resolved because one of them won't. They won't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so here, you have so many people, I'll say people, so many people who stayed too long.
Right.
And didn't have the resources in the first place, to handle when these things come up. And honestly, that's just, when I talk about love in any years, I'm like, listen, you have got to keep working on yourself.
Mhm.
I had an experience a few years ago. It was really funny because I don't even remember what it was, but I was into, personal development and personal growth. And my husband's he's a web hosting engineer and works with servers. So personal growth is like, what? Like he's a techie. And I was just like, I feel like we need to go to a marriage retreat. Like we got to figure out what's wrong with our relationship. And so I signed us up. He's like, okay. So I signed us up for one. We go to this marriage retreat and we're listening to all the problems of all the other couples in the room. And we're looking at each other and I'm like, yeah, we're good. Like we're totally like, we don't have these problems, like this is, so sometimes it's good to go to things like that just to realize that you aren't dealing with what you think,
Yeah.
And so I finally just said, I need to understand what you're passionate about because I'm out here like in Kenya saving the world and blah, 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 and I was like, what are you passionate about? And he said, all I've really wanted is to be a good husband and father. And I am a good husband and father because I support you in doing the things that you're passionate about. And I support our kids in doing what they're passionate about. And I hold down the fort so that when you're doing these things, the kids have stability. And I was like, you are so right. And that is your passion. Okay, I can help you achieve that. Because once I knew what he was passionate about, I was like, I'm going to help you be the best husband and father that you can be because that's what you care about. And I said to him, hey, if we won the lottery, which we don't play the lottery, but whatever. But I was just like, if we could afford for you to retire early, what would you want to do? And he said, follow you around the world, saving it and carrying your luggage. And I was like, great, let's do that, because he knows that's what's important to me. So, and I can achieve helping him to be the best husband and father and achieve my, passion and purpose as well. But what I tell people all the time, and, I do life coaching and business coaching. And what I tell people all the time is I was like, your purpose is you. Your purpose is to develop you inside a marriage, outside a marriage, inside 3 marriages, outside 3 marriages, whatever. Your purpose is you. And that's what Heavenly Father cares about the most. It's the worth of a soul. And he's not saying, I only care about your personal development inside this relationship that's abusive. What he's saying is, I care about you. And I care about you being in a relationship that is supportive for you and that is growing. And often relationships just flat out die because they're not committed to their own personal growth and their collective personal growth.
Yeah. And that is something that Jeff and I have in common. And I think what makes us work so well. And it's actually what I got really intentional about was the 4 things I wanted to create with someone. And he was
Mhm.
going in those same directions. And that's ultimately what brought us together, was those things in common that we had in moving in the same direction. And I totally agree that developing ourselves in or out of a marriage, with or without, family around, empty nesters, in the middle of child rearing, no kids, like whatever it is, whatever our life brings, developing us is paramount. And it's what creates a healthy relationship ultimately, because
Absolutely.
then you come together as 2 whole people who aren't trying to complete each other.
Well, and who aren't
Right.
looking to the other one for the deficiencies in themselves. I mean,
Um,
I want to go back to something you said about that earlier. Because we talked a minute ago about the divorce decision. I'll let people listen to the episode, but the principle is basically focus on what you can control, and all you can control is you. And
Mhm.
and that's really where a lot of people think working on my relationship means working on my spouse and getting them to change.
Well, and then
And
it's also accepting the reality of the situation, where your spouse actually is,
or
and
your
can you
dating
accept it?
partner. I mean, it.
Oh, yes,
So
any kind of relationship, if we don't know or are willing to see the reality of it, then we can't make wise choices.
I actually have, because I work with a lot of Kenyans,
Mhm.
and I have intense working relationships with some of them because of the type of work that we're trying to do. And I recognize that their life experiences are very different from mine. I mean, if we're dealing with, 1 in 4 in Utah, we're dealing with 1 in 1 in developing countries. And so I have written, because I never know when their trauma responses are going to show up. And I never know when my trauma responses are going to show up because I
Yeah.
experienced it, right? So I have written on a post-it note just right here on my desk. It says, this is who they are right now. This is how they're showing up. I choose my response. The
Right.
reality is that everybody changes throughout life. Spouses, children, obviously, everybody changes throughout life. In fact, we talk about that 7-year cycle, right? And I've had 7-year cycles. And I'm like, if I were to go back and analyze every 7-year cycle, I'm so different in each one. And so I choose my response to how they're showing up. But I don't let them become my trigger.
Mm. Or if I know I try to teach that if it becomes your trigger, it's ready to heal, and you can allow it to be a gift to just release whatever comes up.
Sure, but then I control what that looks like, right?
Right.
I don't react, I respond.
Yes.
You
And
know, so I don't, if I'm triggered, I don't react. If I
yeah.
trigger, I respond.
Yeah, and we call
Okay.
that emotional sunburns when they come up, and it takes you by surprise. And then you sometimes have to take a deep breath and realize that it's their trigger, that it's their
Mhm.
sunburn you just touched on, and you can have compassion for them. And if it triggered something in you, and you can have compassion for yourself, and then, like you said, respond more intentionally rather than react.
Well, and let's face it, I mean, arguments typically, like people say things in arguments that they regret saying 20
Mhm.
minutes later.
Mhm.
Like everybody universally across the world, they regret it and they want to backtrack it and they wish they hadn't said it. And when you allow for that, um, I mean, Dave used to say, you just let things like build up and then you explode on me, and I didn't even know it was an issue. And I was like, yep, you're right. So I'm just going to tell you something's an issue. So I'll be like, the dishes are an issue right now, or this is an issue or something like that. Like, and so I try to honor that the worst thing that I can do for him is all of a sudden explode because he didn't see it coming. But when he said that, when he was like, you do this, we have these jokes where one time I said to him, how much do you love me? This was early on in marriage. I'm like, how much do you love me? He's like, I love you just enough. I was like, what does that mean? He said,
Not what
not
you were
what it
hoping
sounded
for.
like in my head. He's like, that's not, no, that's not. but it became a joke, right?
Like when
Because
Barack Obama said that Hillary Clinton was likable enough.
right. I mean, we say these things and then we're like open mouth, pull out foot, right? And so it became a joke. And so he'll say, I love you. And I'm like, oh, I'm so fond of you as well. You know, like, I mean, so we use these kind of platitudes. But you know, Jack Canfield teaches event plus response equals outcome. And so you look at the event, you look at your response, and then ultimately that's what creates the outcome. And I think that the better you are at your response, the better the outcome. In dating, in life, in any relationship, in friendships, learning to, and that goes back to how are you personally developing, like getting your own life in order and becoming the best you. Because I don't believe, I mean, I absolutely believe in the sanctity of being a wife and being a mother, but I don't believe that that's why I'm on this planet. I believe I'm on this planet to learn the lessons I need to learn personally, and that those are vehicles for it.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, people who never get married, you know, I can't say, oh, you're just, you just, your purpose didn't matter because you didn't choose or because you didn't have those opportunities. It always goes back to the individual. I have spent years trying to teach my children, you know, referencing the helicopter thing. I'm like, if I have pursued what I love doing this work in Kenya, to show my children how to pursue what they love. Because if they're not going to learn it from me, who are they going to learn it from? Because it's certainly not going to be in a classroom in a high school, right? So I'm like, we have to, as individuals, continue to pursue what we love, continue to pursue our own personal growth in or out of relationships so that we can teach our children, so that we can model that for the next generation, because we're raising a lot of wimpy kids, wimpy, not resilient kids, you know, because they don't have to do hard things and they don't have to pursue that.
Well, and I hope they'll learn like from us, because I think we're all doing that. I mean, at least the three of us, and hopefully a lot of our listeners. You know, I wanted to speak to the event plus response equals outcome, and that we get to choose our response. And we call it divorce proofing our marriage. When we made the agreement that when either one of us is triggered emotionally, when one of us is just flooded and we know we're not going to resolve a problem, we know we're just going to do damage, we call timeouts and we go and self-soothe, and we come back and we can resolve it in 5 minutes instead of spending hours and hours and hours hurting each other. Like, and that has been a lifesaver. And I think it's something that every couple needs, is some kind of agreement as to how to handle that.
And that's the personal awareness piece, right? That's the piece of, oh my gosh, your date was flirting with me, versus, you know, hey, he looked at me and then we moved on with the conversation, right? It's that awareness piece of her response and how weird it was for me to be like, he said, well, do you want to date him? Because I'm not. I mean, if he asked you out, that's fine. He never did. But it's a personal awareness of how we're responding to a situation that we can develop. This is not an inherent thing that all of us know how to do. I mean,
and that we're responsible for our own emotional well-being.
Right. Absolutely.
No one else can do that for us. And we often try to put that on our partner.
And it really is those boundaries, you know.
Here's the other thing, Heidi. I mean, when you were 21, you were probably in a very different kind of 7-year cycle as when you were 30. And I've thought about that in terms of, you know, in my first marriage, I came from a family a lot like your family. I mean, I know your family well also. And there was always conversation and people talking and sharing ideas. And for my first wife, that was an emotionally depleting experience. I mean, she could not keep up in terms of just the energy and the personalities and all of that. She came from a family where every night after dinner, they went into the living room, put on a movie, everyone was quiet, and they all watched the movie, and then they went to bed. And so we had this dynamic where I wanted to come home from work or whatever during the day and interact and be with my family. And she wanted to be sort of off doing her own stuff. And so, of course, we developed a pursuer distancer polarity.
Mm.
And but I think the point I'm making is that maybe you're the guy that comes home every night and he wants to go out to his wood shop in the garage and work all evening on his own projects after dinner. And that's fine. If that's who you are, that's fine. But there may be a wife that has been with kids all day and wants adult company and whatever, and she feels lonely if he's living like that. And so the question, the point I'm really making with that is, okay, that was a question I didn't even know to ask when I first got
Right.
married, even though I had a degree in family science. I didn't
Mhm.
even know that that was something I should think about. And so my point is, okay, when we're in our 20s, we're going to have to figure our way through those kinds of problems if we want to stay married. When we're mid singles, I think it's important to be in that space you talked about where you got to know yourself. You need to be developing as a person, and you need to know how you want to show up in a relationship rather than focusing so much on what am I getting from the other person.
Well, and then show up in every date as you are, so they know what they're getting.
And then if you honestly say, you know, look, I know what I'm like. I like to be out with my guy friends 3 nights a week, or I like to be out in my wood shop and by myself a lot of the time, you know. Well, then if she doesn't like that,
Then
she has
encourage
choices to
her
make.
to go, encourage her to be with her friends, you know, like encourage her to go to a movie. I mean,
And if they're not
when I'm-
married yet, maybe that's a deal breaker, you know.
if you're not married, but if you are married, recognizing, and, you know, I mean, Dave recognized early on that my social battery was a lot more charged than his was, you know? And so, and I never ask permission. I don't say, hey, are you okay with me, you know, going to dinner with Susie and Cindy tonight? I'm like, I'm going to dinner with Susie and Cindy. Okay, great. You know, like we have a shared calendar and stuff like that. And because I know that I'm not competing with attention. We have date nights every week, you know, and if something we have it on Thursdays because so many other conflicts come up on Fridays and Saturdays, and because it's easier to get into restaurants on Thursdays. So we go on Thursdays. If something else comes up on Thursday, we switch to Wednesday or we switch to Tuesday. You know, like we adjust to it so that we have that time together, but so that, you know, I also know that I am totally, because I mean, I am a far more social person than my husband, you know, and I'm fine with that. The interesting thing also is that in friendships, he also, like, I have a lot of male friends that are literally so platonic. I think of them as kind of androgynous, you know, they're platonic because I like to have the conversations with them, not because I'm attracted to them. It's because we have interesting discussions, and I am I process through talking. And so, so early on, you know, I mentioned this brother from another mother that's still my good friend, and he got married a couple of years ago, and Dave and I were literally the only people outside of his family that were invited because it was during COVID. But I can sit and I can talk to Ben for hours and hours and hours. And when Ben comes to visit, I do. And I asked Dave once, I said, does it bother you that I have all of these male friends? Because a lot of them were from when I was single and I never dated them. It's not like these are ex-boyfriends. I never dated them. We just, you know, in Northern Virginia in the 90s, we were all intellectuals, right? We were all overeducated and everybody talked about everything because we didn't have cell phones. So, or if we did, it was just, you know, like Nokias or something like that. So the conversations were a lot different, and we had philosophical conversations and things like that. And he said, no, if you had wanted to marry them, you would have. If they had wanted to marry you, they would have, you know? And that's super important to me because for me, I value conversations. I value connection. I value all of those things that he doesn't in the same way. And so again, event plus response. So if I say, hey, I'm going to go and meet Chris for lunch, and Chris is, an entrepreneur and we've been friends for 10 years, and everything we're going to talk about is business and startup business, because that's all we ever talk about. And he's like, tell him hi, right? That trust level. The
Oh, I
event.
love that. Yeah. And I actually have had jealousy in past relationships, and it drove me crazy. And it
Right.
was
I'm
not
like,
healthy. And
if I
I
want to be
love that
with
Jeff
you,
and I have more of that relationship where,
right.
we've got the boundaries necessary, and we trust each other, and we
Mhm.
can have adult mature conversations with our opposite sex friends in limited capacity. I mean, it's not like constantly like your date nights, but
Sure.
you're prioritizing your relationship, and you're prioritizing your need for your social connection.
Well, and recognizing that when you get married, like your spouse is never going to fulfill every need and
Mhm.
aspect of,
We say the
you
same
know,
thing. Yeah.
they're just not, I mean, and recognizing that, but saying they fulfill my core needs, but I also understand that they don't have to fulfill all my needs, and so being able to develop relationships, having that trust level, having
And allow that for your partner is really
yes,
healthy too. When you can have that trust, that mutual trust and support.
And we tell each
yeah,
other, like if an old girlfriend contacts me and checks in and says, "How are you doing?" I always tell her, and same thing
absolutely.
coming the other way. I always tell her
The
what was said, and
transparency is super important.
It is important because we did exist prior to the relationship, and so we had people in our lives prior to the relationship. It doesn't mean that we wanted to be with them. It just means they were there. What's funny is, thinking about 21, the guy that I dated when I was 21, we dated on and off for 4 years at the end of high school, and then after his mission, we would have been divorced, like absolutely would have been divorced, had we gotten married. And I went to a high school reunion, and his sister-in-law and I are still good friends. And the three of us went out to dinner. Her husband was off hunting or something like that. So the three of us, and I hadn't seen him for years. I don't think I had seen him since I got married. He came to our wedding reception in Arizona. And so we were sitting there talking, and we ultimately broke up because, well, I was at BYU. He had just gotten home from his mission in Phoenix. It just, um, but he said he still lives with, well, he got married, had 4 kids, got custody of them, still lives with his mom. And he said, "Aren't you glad you didn't marry me? Look at how my life turned out." And I started laughing, and I said, "This wouldn't have been your life." I'm like, I was at BYU, like I mean, and so I kind of painted this picture because I was like, this is not, we wouldn't be living with your mother right now like that. I mean, we would probably be divorced, but this would not be your life. And he, like the next week, messaged me and said, "Man, I'm still in love with you." I was like, "No, you're not." I just painted a
Wow.
picture. I just painted a picture for you that you were holding on to because your life is so crappy, like honestly, and I said, "Yeah, okay, we can't have any communication. Like we're
right.
done." Because that's my boundary. And I told Dave about it and stuff. And it was funny though, because over the years, that was like in 2009, so it was a long time ago. And over the years, I would like all of a sudden have a dream about him or something like that. Not like anything inappropriate, but just a dream. And I would say to Dave, "Yeah, it's really weird. I had a dream about him." And he's like, "Why don't you just call him?" And I'm like, "Because that's my boundary. Like I can't be friends with him under those circumstances." And then and Dave was like, "Well, whatever, your decision." And then like a couple of years ago, I was praying for an answer to a particular challenge that I was having with someone in Kenya that I have to work with in a pretty intense situation. And the answer was, message Jason. And I'm like, "Are you serious?" Like, why would I do that?
This
And
inspiration is against my boundary.
I was just like, "What? Why is this?" And it was just persistent. And I was like, and I wasn't Facebook friends with them. Like I was like, I deliberately didn't establish any connection on Facebook or anything like that. But I was like, okay, this is going to be really weird, but okay. And so I think I commented on something, like I went to his public profile or whatever, and I commented on something, and then he messaged me, and he was like, "What's up?" Totally. I mean, we always had a really great friendship, and so we just started chatting and catching up on life and stuff like that. And he said, "Let me ask you a question." And I was like, "Okay." And he said, "Do you ever think of me as the one that got away?"
Oh
And I was
no.
like, "Nope,
Nope.
never." Not at all. And he said, "I want you to know something." And he said, "And I've been sitting on this for like 2 decades, right? I mean, we broke up a long time ago." And he said, I loved you so much, and I knew that I could not be the person that you needed me to be because of where you were going in your life." And he said, "But you always have me as a friend." He's like, "So just so you know, I'm always your friend." And for some reason, that conversation was exactly what I needed, and Heavenly Father knew that, to heal a situation that was going on. And I was like, "Okay, great, thanks." And we like, I think he said Merry Christmas. Like we haven't had a conversation since, right? Like it was just kind of, there it was, that conversation healed. So I think being like understanding that we are eternal beings, and this is a short experience in our lives that we're going to have, and it's hard and it's beautiful and it's amazing, and we go through incredibly difficult times like you're going through right now, and we don't always know. It's not always obvious. I mean, it's one thing if you're going through a situation where you lose a child, but so much of what people go through are internal, and it's not external, and the world doesn't know. And so allowing for that and realizing, okay, if I hadn't had that interaction with Jason, then I wouldn't know that. Not that I need him as a friend. That's not the point. The point is something in me from my childhood basically needed to know that in order to move forward. And so being, yes, absolutely being respectful, but we don't live in a fishbowl. We don't live on an island. Like we have to interact with people, which is why it's not just in your marriage relationship, it's in all relationships that what your response is going to be, that you're going to develop your boundaries, I mean, and I said to Jason,
And then follow the spirit, even if they contradict your boundaries.
exactly. I mean, there have been times where I've said, in working with the Maasai, there's a lot of challenges, and I've literally said, "Heavenly Father, can I go to Guatemala?" Can I change countries? And I'm like, I don't know what to do with this, because their cognitive awareness is not the same as mine. They don't have the resources, they don't have the mentoring, and I'll be like, can I work with someone else, or can I do something else, or whatever? And God's answer is always, just love them more. And I'm like, okay. And I
like
think
you're in the
that,
same situation as them. You don't get to just change towns or just move somewhere
right.
else. Yeah.
But I think that that's the crux of it, is that the response should always be just love them more. And sometimes loving them means letting go in a relationship,
It does.
and being aware that even if it's heartbreaking, but again, having the relationship conversation prior to ghosting, right? But having the conversation and saying, I don't think that this is supportive for either one of us. And let's take time to think about that.
And it can go all the way from there within like a dating relationship to, we've heard divorce called we've had it called the most loving thing.
Yeah,
Divorce is the most loving thing. And
it's really true.
I would absolutely love to just just as we wrap up this conversation, go to two previous points, and one of them actually has to do with this. You said there you couldn't get enough money in the world to re-enter the dating world if your husband were to pass. And we work with those people. We work with
Mhm.
those people who are re-entering the dating world or who don't want to. And that's fine if you really don't want to, but I think a lot of people have an underlying desire for companionship, or at least more love in their life and friendship. And, and so I guess what I want to maybe just say to
Here's
our
my
audience.
caveat. I wouldn't re-enter the LDS singles world.
Okay.
If
Yeah,
somebody
so
set me up on a date and said, oh, I think that you guys should meet each other, fine. I would not go back into singles activities and things like that, because I really truly believe that it just creates a lot of drama.
well, and that's the other thing I wanted to speak to, but I think first I just wanted to make sure that our listeners know that
Yeah.
If you find yourself in the position of no longer being married because your spouse died or because you're divorced, that there's all sorts of ways you can re-enter the dating world,
Absolutely.
so to speak, or the non-dating world of just, developing new relationships, continue
Right.
developing yourself as you meet people who have things in common with you, and create more love in your life, whether it's romantic or not.
Mhm.
And be willing and open to all the experiences and blessings that are in store in your new situation.
Yeah.
What did I want? I wanted to say something specifically about, that there are a lot of horror stories about dating, and you'll hear them all the time if that's what you want to focus on.
Mhm.
But I really encourage people to focus on the positive experiences, because that's what will bring you more of them. And so whatever you do, emphasize those things and talk to people who emphasize those things, because I think that will lead to a much better experience.
And that's exactly what I did in my late 20s.
Mhm.
As I was just like, I've got to shift my focus. That's why I read Men Made Easy. That's why I read 1,000 Questions. That's why I started on that path, of being able to, like, first of all, me having the confidence to ask the questions and not, I don't want to rock the boat because this could be it. And then my choices are limited. Your
Yeah.
choices aren't limited. There are 7 billion people on this planet.
Yes.
They really aren't limited.
And it
But
only takes once.
it only takes once,
It only takes once.
and my dad said, wow, considering how long you waited, like, you really got lucky. And I was like, no, choice.
I
That's
waited
all.
long enough to pick the exactly for me.
Exactly. And
Exactly.
looking back, truthfully, I mean, I can look at my relationships. Everything that I learned and experienced helped prepare me for Kenya. Being on the Institute Council, being a temple worker, attending Institute, the things that I learned that helped me to understand, the work that I'm doing, the tribes that I'm working with and things like that. It was all for my good. And I could not have learned that in a marriage relationship where I was having kids during that time period. I
Right.
had to have a block of time in my life. And Heavenly Father said, this is the block of time in your life that you're going to learn all of this, because I need you to know this for later.
Mhm.
And it can't be done if you've got little kids running around.
And for
right?
me, for you, it was in your 20s. And for me, it was in my 30s as a divorced person. And
Right.
there were so many things I needed to learn in that situation that I couldn't learn any other way. And even though I went in kicking and screaming and thought it was the most horrible thing that could ever happen, it shaped me, and in the best
Absolutely.
of ways.
But when I look back, and it's funny because I once was, this friend that lives a couple miles away, I was dropping his daughter off, and his wife was out of town on business and she was flying home. So I stayed to greet his wife when she got home. She was on her way home from the airport. And I was sitting there talking to him, and we were talking about Kenya, and he's a nurse and he really wants to go and stuff like that. And I said, hey, if you and I had gotten married, what would you have thought of all of this Kenya stuff? And he was like, oh, I think it's great. I think it's cool. I'm like, huh, yeah, you would have supported me through it, wouldn't you? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. Because he does his current wife. I know their relationship well enough. And I was like, isn't that interesting that I dated him like 2 people prior to Dave. But I was like, isn't that interesting that there were relationships that could have supported it, but the other components weren't there, but later they were there. Like if we had held
Yeah.
off. So timing is everything.
Yeah.
Timing.
Timing with the person and even maybe within the relationship. Like it took Jeff and I 2 years to
Absolutely.
get ready for each other after we met, like
Right.
to continue getting ready for each other, because I think our whole lives were doing that.
Yeah. And
Um,
so there's so many factors, but it's really not because somebody looks at you at a dinner party.
Right.
You know,
that's-
like,
Well, if I
and
could
really trusting God in the
I
process.
had one more thing, and then we'll
Go
let
ahead.
Jeff finish. So the YSA wards, like, so you were in the young single adult wards in your 20s, is that correct? Okay.
Mhm.
So my only experience with singles wards were the single adult wards, the mid singles wards, and so it was a different experience for me. There was still some of that, like, oh, okay, we're doing, parties again, like, but that was also kind of fun. But I think for me, it depends on the intention and the reason you're going. Like you said, some people were going to meet cute boys, and then that didn't happen and that didn't work out. See, for me, like, I didn't date much in my ward itself. Like I provided those opportunities outside of that for myself online, and just kept going more for these people can relate to my situation. Some of them are
Sure.
single parents. Some of them, have gone through what or experienced what I have. We have something in common. And I didn't plan to stay forever either. It was like a time period. And I loved it, actually. So for me, it was a special place. And every other week I went to my family ward with my kids. So it was a good balance for me.
Yeah, and that's why I said this is my lens, my experience,
Mhm.
my view based on what I saw.
And I'm
And
sure there's
what,
plenty of people who will relate to that. And,
yeah.
and I think we should just go where the spirit takes us and whatever we feel is most supportive.
Well, one of the things with that though is that there are so many people in a family ward that feel isolated, that need to be brought in, and so I feel like um we don't often see mid singles divorced in our family wards in Utah because they go elsewhere. I think in order to normalize it and
Mhm.
reduce the stigma, that needs to stop, right? That yes, I think that the support system needs to be there, but I don't necessarily feel like it needs to be there at church when you're
Yeah.
going to church. So and so for me, I mean, in my ward, I'm like, my mom's single, she's 78. I don't know of anyone else that is. Like unless they're like a college kid home for the
Like there
summer.
doesn't have to be this special other place for you. Let's
Yes.
integrate. And,
Yeah.
that's what we do
Let's
with our Love and Later
normalize and
Years
let's
group.
support each other.
Everyone is welcome. Like even
Mhm.
people who are remarried and but have previously been through something tragic,
Right.
because they can mentor and give hope to those who are now where
Yes.
they were.
And I think it's so important before people get married to be in a family ward where good marriages are modeled,
Yes.
because you're not going to find good relationships necessarily to model after in a singles ward.
Except for in the
Like,
bishopric, and I did actually notice those, like in
sure,
those couples that were in the bishopric. But
of
yeah, I
course.
know what
But
you're
yeah,
saying.
yeah. I
And
mean, there needs to be like that, because I know going from a singles ward, getting married and going into a family ward was a culture shock for me. And I was like, oh my gosh, you all have lives, like I think it was almost too much of a shock for me, because we still hung out with our single friends after we got married, because we were like, all these people, like they're so busy and they have
how do we
their
relate
lives.
with these new people?
I can't
Yeah.
relate with these new people. And what we're talking about is the gospel, like that's what we're talking about. And I really am like, church should be about the gospel. And then other support groups could be created around that. But the more we normalize differences at church, different situations, different lives, different family situations, the less stigma, the less rejection people will feel, the less people will leave the church. I mean, because they'll feel like they belong, and they belong no matter what their marital status is, matter what their child, their child status is, no matter what, because it's about the gospel and not about your relationship status.
Well, and if
So,
as people who maybe feel like we have a different situation than the standard or the ideal, if we can see ourselves as children of God, like anyone else, and know that our circumstances are perfect for us and that it's part of God's path for us, then we can walk in with confidence, and we can let everyone know that like our path is just as important or just as, normal, or
And
quote
married people
unquote.
need to see that too.
Yeah, I
Married
think we all need
people-
to be able to
Yeah.
walk our path with confidence and with factual statements that aren't shameful.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember hearing a bishop give a talk one time. He was a bishop of a normal family ward. And it made me think about how we show up on Sunday really well dressed. We know all the right things to say, which people apologize for saying the Sunday school answers. And we go through this ritual every week. And I heard this bishop talk about, I could go down every row, and obviously he wouldn't, but he said, I could go down every row and think, okay, on the front row, this married man is dealing with same-sex attraction. On the next row, this guy is worried about losing his job, and his wife lost hers, 3 weeks ago. On this row, they've got a kid that is struggling with their testimony. He says, I literally go down every row and name some big, huge, life-affecting thing that's going on with every single family in the ward. And so why don't we talk about that more? I mean, why don't we share our burdens more? I mean, I have a men's group, and people do in there. And somebody said, yeah, this is what I wish priesthood was like. And I said, well, me too, but we got to change the culture of the church to do that. And we've got to get away from perfectionism and start, mourning with those that mourn and comforting those that stand in need of comfort. And we've got to stop looking at somebody whose marriage broke up as less than.
And isolating them.
You
should go here so that I don't have to see that because I'm too afraid it might happen to me.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's one thing that I wanted to reiterate in this conversation is that, hey, to our listeners, whether you're married, single, whatever, let's be a little forgiving. I mean, and
be more inclusive for sure. That's how Christ was.
We talk to women sometimes about, okay, what if your dating partner has used porn in the past? Because so many LDS men have done that. And I mean, some women say, well, I can't even find someone to date who hasn't done porn. But we talk about, well, is the person taking the steps that they need to take to deal with that? And are they doing it for themselves and not for you or for somebody else? Well, I think it's better to be able to acknowledge, okay, I've had this problem or I've had that problem. This is what I did to deal with it. And somebody else in the room that's having the same problem suddenly feels a little bit less alone, a little bit less, less than. And I think that would be very valuable. So I'm just throwing that out to our audience. The second thing I wanted to say is, you talked a little bit ago about wanting to have confidence or having more confidence as you got older to say the things to the guys that you wanted to say. And so I just want to throw this out there, and then I'll ask you to comment on it, and you can certainly have the last word. But I think this is a core important issue for people dating younger or in their mid-single years. I remember when I was dating in my 20s, and I only dated kind of sporadically back then, and because I really thought I had to get to marriage, I didn't enjoy it very much. And part of the reason was I was scared. I was always worried about getting rejected, and all I could do if I did get rejected is sit and look at the wall for 3 hours, because it was so mortifying to me. And a lot of people who say I hate dating, whether they're 24 or 40, are saying that same thing. And it's too much stress to put myself out there and to ask someone for a date, because what if they say no, and go down the list of things that we worry about. And so we try to do backflips to come up with ways to find love without risk. And okay, well, what if I talk to him at the word linger longer and I drop very subtle hints? Well, I touched him on the arm. Well, okay, you touched him on the arm, that doesn't necessarily mean anything to him. And it goes the other way too. I've heard guys do this same thing, but they want to somehow know before they ask what the answer is going to be. And I want to just put it out there. Let go of the attempt to find love without risk, because it's futile. It almost never works. People don't get your hints. And if you just come out with it and say, I'd like to get to know you better. You seem like a great person. Could we go get a Coke on Tuesday night? Well, gosh, I mean, maybe she says no. Maybe you feel a little bad for a minute, but you're a grown man, grown woman, whatever, shake it off, realize you're still a valuable person.
And I think that is the key. When we know our value, independent of anybody else's choices or our marital status, then we go into every situation knowing we'll be okay no matter what the result is. And we can be more brave.
You mentioned intention, right? So instead of a woman asking a man out, I don't think it would be out of alignment for a woman to say to a man who she's been talking to, just to let you know, if you were to ask me out on a date, I would say yes, and leave it at that, and just, it puts the ball in his court, but it also answers that question for him. If he doesn't ask out, he's not interested. So that's fine. If he does ask you out, then you know that you were right? Like you have that intuition. There is a saying, everything you want is on the other side of fear. Everything you want is on the other side of your comfort zone. And I call bunk on that. Whatever. We create fear and we create a comfort zone. It's an arbitrary line. And one of the things that I teach, and I'll wrap up with this, I teach this in all of my coaching, 2 things, is that 1, expand your comfort zone in order to receive what you want. So if something seems scary, you just say, I'll have that. I'm expanding my comfort zone to receive that. Instead of, I've got to get out across that totally invisible and arbitrary fear line that's not real, right? I mean, we know fear is false evidence appearing real. Right. So it's expand your comfort zone. The second thing is that when you get stuck in your life, in your relationships, in dating, in anything like that, asking the question, what else is possible? Because it's an open-ended question and anything else is possible, right? But we get so stuck in trying to figure out our current situation instead of saying, whatever is happening right here, whatever is showing up right now, this isn't working, but what else is possible? And then you're open, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, now I can start answering that question, which again is anything. So expanding your comfort zone, what else is possible? And just simply saying, in a dating situation, if you ask me out, I would say yes. I'll just leave it at that. I love it. It doesn't mean, and for men, if a woman says that to you, it does not mean she's ready to, go to the temple and have your babies. I mean, that's not what it
No,
means.
and we don't like that either. We think
Right.
you ought to
It
be
just
able to
simply means that
go
she
out
would
for
say
one
yes.
night, and that's all the commitment there is for.
Exactly. And so then if a woman is brave enough to say that to you, then ask her out, because it can just be one date. It does not have to be eternity.
Oh yeah. I love that. And it's empowering to women to be able to take some intentional steps towards
Yes.
people they are interested in, while also allowing the man to step in and take a role, which we want them to do. So perfect. I love that.
Yeah.
There was a line I used to use when I was single that I got from Jim Carrey, but he would say, or he said, my answer is yes, I will go out with you. And she said, I didn't just ask you out. And he says, well, yeah. And he referenced some comment she made that wasn't asking him out at all, but it's sort of a funny way to sort of put it out there.
Absolutely. And you can be funny about it.
If she responds positively, then I say, well, let's have your digits,
Yeah. By the way, if you were thinking of asking me out after this conversation that we've just had for an hour, I mean, I would be so much braver now to do this, honestly, because I just released the outcome. But I would be like, hey, since we've been standing here talking in the doorway for an hour at a church dance, if you asked me out, the answer would be yes. If you want to keep talking in the doorway, then I'm just going to move on, I mean, because at some point you do have to move on. You can be interested in someone, and if it's not progressing,
I love your directness, because you're like, okay, all the awkward situations we put ourselves into, to have these conversations, you're like, I'm just going to get myself out of this by saying this.
Yeah. Take that leap off the high dive, don't stand there looking down. That's terrifying.
My brother from another mother once emailed me back when we were single, and he basically was like, it was this whole philosophical email about how he had been thinking about asking me out on a date, but didn't know if it was right or not. Like, he was basically talking himself out. And I was like, are you, what? This is weird. And I wrote back and I said, if you want to ask me out, ask me out. This is weird. That was it. And I mean, it was just so funny because of course we never did go out because he talked himself out of it. But I was just like, oh my word, why make this so complicated? It's just dinner. It's just a date, and if you're not that interested, just imagine that they're a female, or a male.
Expanding the comfort zone rather than trying to somehow pass it. Just expand it.
Just expand it.
Yeah.
Just love expand it.
Some I mean, I think that's
dates were with people that I wasn't interested in, but I had so much fun.
Yeah.
So if we have a central theme from Heidi, and she's covered a lot, I think courage is right up there. The courage to push through and expand your comfort zone. And so folks, have courage, and remember that any time is a great time for more love in your life.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you.